In 2005, Procter Gamble paid $57 billion for the Gillette Company, one of the largest consumer goods acquisitions in history. Today, the Gillette name alone is worth close to $15 billion, one of the most recognized brands on the planet. The stern, mustachioed face, printed on billions of those razor blade wrappers, belonged to a real man, King Camp Gillette. And when he died in 1932, he was nearly bankrupt. The company carrying his name had been taken from him piece by piece, diluted, outmaneuvered, and finally seized in a hostile merger. His fortune, once worth millions, had been wiped out by the same stock market crash that erased 90% of American wealth. His only son would die decades later without children, ending the family line entirely. Here's the part almost nobody knows. The man who invented the sell-it-cheap profit on the refill business model, the same model behind printer ink, coffee pods, and razor cartridges to this day, spent his entire adult life writing books arguing that capitalism itself was the root cause of human suffering. He designed an entire utopian city meant to replace American civilization. He offered a former president of the United States $1 million to run it. And every single night, he went home from inventing modern consumer capitalism to writing about how to destroy it. He called himself, in his own words, a man with two souls. Neither one ever won. This is how both of them ended up broke. The story starts almost 300 years before King Camp Gillette was born, on a single violent night in France. On August the 24th, 1572, royal troops and Catholic mobs began the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, slaughtering thousands of French Protestants across the country. Among the survivors was a Huguenot minister named Jacques de Gillette, who escaped his hometown of Bergerac with his life and nothing else. His property seized, his community destroyed. He fled to Scotland, then to England, where his family quietly rebuilt. 3 generations later, 2 of his descendants, Jonathan and Nathan, crossed the Atlantic in 1630 aboard a ship called the Mary and John, part of the Great Puritan migration into Massachusetts Bay. The family name drifted through several spellings over the decades before settling on Gillette. For the next 2 centuries, they were farmers, ministers, and small tradesmen scattered across New England and the old Northwest Territory. Unremarkable, resilient, thoroughly American. By the time King Camp Gillette's father, George Wolcott Gillette, was born in 1824, the family's restless, inventive streak was already showing. His biographer described him, not unkindly, as a sometime postmaster, weekly newspaper editor, and inventive thinker. A description that's really just a polite way of saying he tried a lot of things, and none of them quite worked. King Camp Gillette was born on January the 5th, 1855, in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. Named King, according to family law, partly for tradition and partly because his parents simply liked the sound of it. His father's most serious business attempt, a company manufacturing power-driven horse clippers, never scaled. When the family relocated to Chicago, George pivoted into hardware supply instead. Every corner of the household seemed to catch the same restless, inventive fever. King's older brother filed patents on everything from self-sealing bottle stoppers to devices politely described by the family biographer as swimming attachments. Invention wasn't a hobby in that house. It was the family religion, and financial disappointment was simply an accepted cost of practicing it. King's mother, Fanny Lemira Camp Gillette, was a different kind of force entirely, described as serene but a firm disciplinarian, the kind of person who ran a household with total control. In 1887, she published the White House Cookbook, which went on to sell millions of copies over the following decades and remained continuously in print for over a century. It would end up outlasting nearly everything her son ever built. Then, on October the 8th, 1871, the Great Chicago Fire tore through the city, destroying more than 17,000 buildings, including George Wolcott Gillette's hardware business. King was 16 years old, watching his father's entire livelihood burn to the ground in a single weekend through absolutely no fault of his own. That memory would resurface again and again in the books King Camp Gillette wrote decades later. A teenager's helplessness at watching an arbitrary, uncontrollable system destroy a life's work, hardening slowly into a full political philosophy. For the next 2 decades, King Camp Gillette worked as a traveling salesman, hauling a trunk of samples from city to city, filing the occasional patent that never went anywhere. By 1890, he'd filed 4 of them, none commercially significant, and had earned something of a reputation as a chronic tinkerer whose mind never quite stayed on the job in front of him. That same year, he married Atlanta Ella Gaines, the daughter of an Ohio oilman, and their only child, King Gaines Gillette, was born in 1891. The turning point arrived through his job, not his tinkering. Gillette took a sales position with the Baltimore Crown Cork and Seal Company, where he befriended the founder, William Painter, the inventor of the disposable metal bottle cap, a product used exactly once and thrown away, guaranteeing every single customer would need to buy more, forever. Painter's advice to Gillette became, arguably, the single most consequential sentence in the history of American consumer products. Find something people use and discard, something that forces them to keep coming back. Every additional customer, Painter told him, is a foundation of profit. Gillette became consumed by the challenge, mentally auditioning every disposable object he could think of. Toothbrushes, pins, buttons, for years, without success. Then, one morning in the summer of 1895, standing in front of a mirror in Brookline, Massachusetts, he found his straight razor too dull to use. The idea arrived in full, almost all at once. A razor blade so thin it could be stamped from cheap sheet steel, sharp on both edges, held rigid inside a metal frame, used until dull, and then simply thrown away instead of resharpened. "I have got it. Our fortune is made," he wrote to his wife that same day. There was just one problem. Every metallurgist and engineer he consulted, including faculty at MIT, told him it was physically impossible. Sybil, you couldn't make steel thin enough to be cheap and disposable while also hard enough to hold a shaving edge. Gillette refused to accept that answer and spent 6 more years searching for someone who could prove the experts wrong. He eventually found that person in William Nickerson, an MIT-trained machinist with a gift for reframing mechanical problems from scratch. Nickerson's breakthrough was elegant. Don't force the blade itself to be rigid. Let the holder do that job, and simply bend a wider, thinner blade into shape once it was locked inside. It was the kind of solution that looks obvious only after somebody's already thought of it. In September 1901, Gillette and Nickerson incorporated their company in a rented office above a fish shop on Atlantic Avenue in Boston. On paper, the company was capitalized at $500,000. In actual cash raised, it had 5,000. King Camp Gillette held 35% of the shares, enough to matter, nowhere near enough to guarantee control, a gap that would define the rest of his life. The first year, the company sold 51 razor sets and 168 blades total. That's it. But within a couple of years, growth turned vertical. Tens of thousands of razors, millions of blades, manufacturing plants opening in Paris, Berlin, and Montreal by the end of the decade. Then came the moment that turned Gillette from a successful American brand into a genuine global institution, and it had almost nothing to do with marketing. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, military regulations required soldiers to shave daily, for a brutally practical reason. The rubber seal on a gas mask only forms an airtight fit against clean-shaven skin, and on the Western Front, that seal was the difference between living and dying in a chlorine gas attack. The US government contracted directly with Gillette to supply the entire American Expeditionary Force with what became known as the khaki set, roughly 3.5 million razor kits, paid for entirely by Washington. Sales exploded from just over 1 million razors in 1917 to 3.5 million razors and 32 million blades the very next year. The real payoff came after the war ended. Millions of young American men who'd never shaved daily in their lives came home in 1919 with a Gillette habit drilled into them by 2 years of military discipline, a permanent customer base created, essentially, by the US government, at government expense, because of German chemicals. Weapon had made a close shave a matter of survival. It's the kind of chain reaction King Camp Gillette, in his other life, would have pointed to as living proof that the entire system was insane. Here's where the story splits in two, because both halves were happening at once. By 1910, years before the war even began, King Camp Gillette was already a millionaire from razor royalties and dividends. His face was appearing on razor packaging in dozens of countries, and in his private hours, he was writing book after book, arguing that the entire economic system making him rich needed to be torn down and replaced. In 1894, a full year before his razor epiphany, Gillette self-published a 200-page manifesto called The Human Drift, arguing that competition itself was, in his words, the root of all evil, a system that wasted the majority of human effort on the friction of businesses competing against each other, rather than actually producing anything. His solution was something he called the United Company, a single publicly owned mega-corporation that would gradually absorb every industry on Earth, distribute profits equally to every citizen, and make money itself obsolete. A full third of that book was devoted to a city Gillette designed down to the smallest detail. Metropolis, a perfect rectangle spanning from Buffalo to Rochester, powered entirely by hydroelectric energy from Niagara Falls. He was writing this at the exact moment Tesla and Westinghouse were proving large-scale AC power transmission actually worked, and he wanted Tesla himself to design the grid. Metropolis would house all 60 million Americans of his era in enormous porcelain-tiled towers, connected by transparent sidewalks so residents could see the labor keeping their city running beneath their own feet. No private vehicles, no money, no poverty by design. In 1910, Gillette moved from writing to actually trying to build it, chartering something called World Corporation and making his boldest move yet, a public offer of $1 million to former President Theodore Roosevelt, asking him to lead it. Roosevelt declined almost immediately. Gillette reportedly tried Henry Ford next, a conversation that ended in a shouting match. Ford apparently took real offense at being asked to hand his company over to a socialist collective. In the early 1920s, Gillette teamed up with Upton Sinclair, the famous author of The Jungle, co-writing The People's Corporation, a more polished restatement of the same core idea. He described his own contradiction openly in a letter to Sinclair. "My life seemed to separate into two distinct entities, one devoted to earning a living, the other devoted to imagining a world where earning a living the old way wouldn't exist anymore." While Gillette was designing a fictional city with no money in it, he was quietly losing control of the very real company that bore his name. And he'd started the process himself. In the company's earliest, most desperate years, when it had burned through its $5,000 in cash and racked up debt with no sales to show for it, Gillette gave away most of his own shares to friends and family in exchange for their support, diluting his own ownership before a single outside investor ever showed up. He believed in the product so completely that he assumed its value would outrun how much of it he still actually owned. An Irish-American businessman named John Joyce invested in the struggling company on terms heavily favorable to himself, further diluting Gillette's stake. By 1910, at the very moment Gillette's public fame and fortune were peaking, he sold off most of his remaining shares to Joyce, partly to fund his California real estate and his utopian book projects, partly out of sheer exhaustion from years of boardroom conflict. He kept his title, his salary, and his face on every wrapper. What he no longer had was any actual say in how the company was run. When Joyce died in 1916, control passed to a New York banker named Edward Aldred, who ran the company through proxies and installed an operations chief named Frank Fahey, leaving King Camp Gillette, the founder, sitting in an honorary role in California with no real power over a company that had grown into one of the most valuable brands in the world. The final blow came from a rival named Henry Gaisman, a genuinely brilliant and ruthless businessman who'd built a competing razor company into Gillette's most dangerous threat. When Gillette's original blade patent expired in 1921, Gaisman moved fast, developing both a better blade design and a far more efficient manufacturing process. By the late 1920s, Gillette's own management, recognizing their technology was falling behind, secretly designed a new blade system of their own and planned a major launch, only for Geisman to somehow obtain detailed knowledge of the new design before it was ever announced. He quietly amended his own patent to cover it, then bought advertising space in the Saturday Evening Post, the most widely read magazine in America, a full week before Gillette's planned launch, openly displaying his patent number. Gillette's new blades, still legally unprotected and marked only patents pending, were dead on arrival. Geisman's company sued for patent infringement immediately. Then an audit ordered as part of the lawsuit uncovered something worse. Gillette's own management had been fraudulently misreporting sales figures to inflate the company's profits. The disclosure sent the stock into freefall, handing Geisman enormous leverage in merger negotiations. To make matters worse, Gillette's operations chief had already pre-sold nearly the entire year's production of the failed new blade at steep discounts, locking the company into ruinous margins right as the lawsuit landed. Aldred, over-leveraged in Gillette stock that was now collapsing, had no real choice left. The merger closed in October 1930 at a price roughly 4 times what Geisman had originally asked for 2 years earlier, before he'd outmaneuvered the entire company. In the middle of that chaos, Camp Gillette personally sold 20,000 of his remaining shares back to the Com, penny in August 1930 at roughly $82 each. By January 1931, those same shares were worth $21, down from a peak near $125 just 2 years earlier. He had watched 3/4 of his remaining fortune evaporate in 6 months, in a company that no longer answered to him at all. At the peak of his wealth, Camp Gillette had assembled a genuine California real estate empire, a Beverly Hills mansion, a Palm Springs desert estate, a ranch in Tulare County, a retreat in Newport Harbor, and above all, the King Gillette Ranch in Calabasas, over 500 acres in the Santa Monica Mountains, centered on a 25-room Spanish colonial mansion designed by the celebrated architect Wallace Neff. Construction finished in 1929. Weeks later, the stock market crashed. By 1932, it had wiped out roughly 90% of American stock market value, and Camp Gillette's remaining net worth was tied up almost entirely in 2 things that were both collapsing at once: Gillette stock, already wounded from the Geisman merger, and California real estate that, in the depths of the Depression, simply had no buyers left. The man whose face was recognized in drugstores from Boston to Bombay couldn't sell a mansion he'd finished building just months earlier. Camp Gillette died in Los Angeles on July 9, 1932, at 77 years old, nearly bankrupt, buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. His widow, unable to keep up the Calabasas estate, sold it in 1935 to MGM director Clarence Brown for a fraction of what it had cost to build. One of the films Brown went on to make there was Anna Karenina, a story about a woman whose life fell apart in slow, inescapable stages, filmed on the grounds of a man whose own life had done exactly the same thing. His only son, King Gaines Gillette, wanted nothing to do with razors. He built a life in ranching and the oil business instead, eventually serving as president of an oil company in Los Angeles. He died of a heart attack in 1955 at 64, leaving behind a widow and no children. With his death, the Gillette bloodline, the same family that had fled religious persecution in France in 1572, crossed an ocean in 1630 and rebuilt itself across 300 years of American history, simply ended. The company he'd founded above a fish shop went on to sell for $57 billion. The utopian city he'd poured a third of a book into designing was never built, not one porcelain tower of it. The $1 million he offered a president went nowhere. And the fortune he assembled was consumed in the end by exactly the forces he'd spent 40 years writing books against: competition, speculation, patent warfare, and a stock market crash that punished people who'd done nothing wrong except participate in the system that produced it. The detail that might say the most, though, is the smallest one. His mother's cookbook, the one she wrote in 1887, solving the plain, practical problem of how to feed a family well, stayed continuously in print for well over a century, long after her son's razor company had passed through 3 owners and his utopian manifestos had gone to gather dust in university archives. She never needed Niagara Falls or Tesla or a former president's endorsement. She needed a kitchen, and the same discipline she'd tried, and largely failed, to pass on to the one child of hers who spent his whole life trying to reorganize the entire world instead of just the one household in front of him. He wanted to build Metropolis. He built Gillette instead, and then, piece by piece, he lost that too. That's the real story behind the face on the razor. A man who spent his life fighting the very system his own invention helped perfect, and lost to it in the end anyway. If you're new here, this is Brand Ancestry. Every video, we dig into the hidden history behind the everyday things nobody thinks to question. If that's the kind of rabbit hole you enjoy, subscribe and stick around. And I want to know, was the disposable razor a betrayal of everything King Camp Gillette believed in? Or was it, in its own strange way, the only idea of his that actually worked? Drop your take in the comments. I read every one. See you in the next one.